Hello, my name is Fareed Khan. I'm the founder of the anti-racism group Canadians United Against Hate and the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations for the Rohingya Human Rights Network. I'd like to welcome viewers to Diversity Dialogues, conversations with prominent people who work in the area of human rights and combating racism. We are privileged today to speak with Professor John Packer, who is Director of the Human Rights and Education Center at the University of Ottawa, in addition to being a Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa Law School. John has had a very distinguished career internationally. He has held academic positions at the University of Essex, where he was Director at its world-renowned Human Rights Center, and at the Fletcher School of International Affairs at Tufts University. He has held fellowships at Cambridge and Harvard universities and lectured at universities and professional institutions around the world. In addition, John has held positions with a number of international organizations, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Labour Organization, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, where he investigated serious human rights violations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Myanmar. John got his bachelor's degree in politics from the University of Manitoba and a master's in law from the University of Essex in the UK. Welcome, John, to Diversity Dialogues.
Pleasure.
Before beginning, I'd like to disclose that John and I have worked together for a number of years on the Rohingya human rights file for Rohingya in Myanmar, something I imagine will continue until the Rohingya see justice. So, John, let's begin. It seems that many of the issues relating to human rights violations over the decades involves an underlying foundation of hate, bigotry, or racism. However, the mechanisms that were set up to deal with matters relating to human rights and hate after World War II seem to be ineffective. And there seems to be little to no political will among nations like Canada that claim to be defenders of human rights to take the decisive actions needed to address the attacks on human rights around the world. Do you think this means that we're entering or have entered a post-human rights era where the persecution and brutal oppression of people like the Uyghurs, the Palestinians, the Rohingya, and Kashmiris are ignored in order to placate political and business interests at the international level?
So thanks, Fareed, first of all, for inviting me to contribute to this series. It's a real pleasure and an honor. And with regard to the topic that you've raised, this is one that's now being discussed in many parts of the world. But I would like to look at it from two perspectives. The premise of ineffectiveness has to be put in historical context. So we need to remember that before the UN Charter adopted and incorporated human rights as one of the fundamental objects and purposes of the new post-war order, as it was 75 years ago, it was not, in fact, legitimate in international relations to talk about human rights in terms of the conduct of states within their own jurisdictions, their territory, their own people. I mean, that's what gave rise famously or infamously to the Munich conference, where Chamberlain attended and then basically granted a free hand to Hitler and the Third Reich, saying that that was their affair. Post-1945, the world has taken a different course, and we should all be pleased about that, where we not only have identified this fundamental standard that human rights is an obligation of states, so irrespective of nationality, ethnicity, and so forth, within the state has duties that it owes to every human being. And for many decades, that idea was elaborated in more detail in norms and standards and institutions, mechanisms, and so forth. So now we have robust discussions at the UN Human Rights Council and all sorts of regional organizations, bilaterally, about the issues. What I think you're pointing to in the kind of post-human rights discussion is the disappointment that that discussion has not in many cases led to changes on the ground, to behavioral changes within the state, where particularly egregious situations such as you mentioned can be redressed. And I think that's an absolutely valid concern. And more than that, I would say that we're at a point now where the human rights project, if I can call it that globally, has been successful to the extent that people around the world know about human rights. They claim their human rights, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's the Rohingya or it's in South Sudan and so forth, people articulate a human rights claim that they want to enjoy freedoms, they want to have a participation over their destiny and things like that. And that is a language now which we can understand. But what they're also saying is that it's not enough that the discussion takes place or even that there's condemnation. And that's really showing where I think the world now is facing a challenge. And that challenge is effectiveness in the sense of change. And I would say that we need to do better, obviously. And more than that, I would say if in the next relatively short period of time, we do not find effective mechanisms, there's a risk here of badly disappointing people who have, let me say, placed their faith in human rights. And if that is lost, then all bets are off and we could really revert to past times.
But we don't have to look very far when we talk about concerns about human rights. We can look at Canada. We can look at Canadian history. We can look at, for example, how Indigenous people have been treated in Canada. And certainly after 9/11, we can look at the way that governments decided to deal with security threats by focusing in on one particular community, which is Muslims, in ways that violated their rights. We have the example of Maher Arar, who was rendered to Syria and was tortured there, and Canadian officials were complicit in that. We've got the cases of the 4 others who were held. I'm sorry, I can't recall all of their names at the moment, but there were 4 others who ultimately were given compensation by the federal government. So even within Canada, we have this issue of human rights, and one could say that, well, not one could say, but there have been accusations made publicly by people who are far more qualified than me, who say that there is a racist thread running through various policies in the Canadian government, whether it's in the RCMP in their dealings with Indigenous people, whether it's with CSIS dealing with the Muslim community, or whether it's policies that are racist against black people and other people of color. So even in Canada, we have this an advanced democratic nation. We see human rights being violated, and it's based on this foundation of racism. So, if we can't deal with our own problems at home, how are we supposed to go out to the world and say we are the defenders of human rights and we're going to combat hate and racism?
Well, first of all, you repeated a few times, even in Canada,
Yeah.
which belies a kind of assumption that Canada should be better than that, a priori, that it would somehow naturally be better. And I think we need to be honest here that Canada not only never was, we were a colony like others. If you ask our Indigenous peoples, there was no romantic period of enlightenment in that colonialism or its ongoing legacy, which we live today. But more than that, I just mentioned that human rights was a movement that had a blossoming at the end of the Second World War and incorporated the UN Charter and so forth. Well, it did not actually make its way legally into Canadian constitutional law really before the 1970s, and specifically when we set up, for example, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, because the original, even in the 1960s, the Bill of Rights that Diefenbaker brought in was not legally binding, for example. So it's only in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1992 with our Constitution, 1982, sorry, with our Constitution, that we brought legally binding human rights. And that corpus of human rights is not even the complete corpus or body of human rights that we're obliged to respect internationally. So just the sobering element here, we're not what we sometimes pretend to be, and we never were. Now, we have progressed substantially. So now I think when people say even in Canada, we are able to say that relative to the rest of the world, Canada has quite robust, not only legal protections, but institutions. We have lots of ombudspersons and human rights commissions and all sorts of bodies and so forth. And these are not just rhetorical commitments. These are meaningful, they're accessible and so forth. Have they magically addressed the underlying social phenomena of prejudice, of ignorance that manifests not only in racism but sexism and many of the other ills that society has? No, of course not. And there's a huge socialization that needs to take place. Now, in terms of our government, though, Yeah, I think there was a tendency of a degree of complacency, a degree of complacency, where the, many Canadians, I think, somehow think this problem is not that bad. And again, leaving aside, and we should not leave aside Indigenous peoples or other communities, I think that it's taken something like the coronavirus to expose how really deep and bad the discriminatory treatments, the exclusion, the inequality is. And we have seen this also in the kind of popular sentiments expressed in some parts of Canada and by some people in Canada, which unfortunately mimic things we hear south of the border and elsewhere. And that's extremely disconcerting. So there's a big job to be done in Canada to make stronger and better. And then in terms of the last part of your question, in terms of Canada and the world, well, there's a long discussion we should have there. I think, very honestly, I think we have a popular mythology in Canada that we are great human rights defenders. I've worked internationally for 30 years, and honestly, I haven't seen it that much. And in fact, I would say, under some of our previous governments, we were contributors to causing harm. For example, protecting some of our Canadian corporations in the mining sphere, for example, that were clearly involved in really repressive activities. But Canada could and should be doing a lot better, and this is the challenge now, is not rhetorically. I think now we have a kind of rhetorical commitment and we pat ourselves on the back, and it's not followed by the concrete action and far removed from what the potential is for Canada to make a meaningful difference.
So, in our work, as we've worked together on the issue of the Rohingya, both yourself and myself had made observations to the effect that Canada is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that it seems that while the Canadian government, or even provincial governments, they talk about human rights, when it comes to actually taking meaningful action, they seem to be empty words. As someone who teaches in the area of human rights law, could you give your take on how defense of human rights has been valued by Canadian politicians in recent history, and what we need to do as Canadians to make sure that politicians don't chip away at our rights little by little? That seems to be happening.
Well, there are a couple elements to this. In terms particularly of foreign policy, and almost any policy, I would say, we always have to watch, does the walk follow the talk? So does conduct, is conduct commensurate with declarations? And I would add more to that, follow the money. Do funding decisions and budgetary decisions follow the policy decisions? And I think if you scrutinize in the last number of years, even with what I would consider a positive change of policy between our previous government and the current government, to be blunt, I think the Harper approach to human rights internationally was not helpful. I know that the instructions to our foreign service were not, for example, to defend human rights defenders. Our current government has changed that. In fact, reversed it. We actually have a policy formally called Voices, which is to assist and respond to human rights defenders, particularly the Feminist International Assistance Policy and now the declared Feminist Foreign Policy, although it has no content yet. So those are positive changes in direction. But if we follow through, as I mentioned, does the policy and content incorporate the elements that the rhetoric would suggest should follow, then we quickly see it's kind of lacking. For example, I mentioned the feminist foreign policy, literally there is no, they're consulting on it, so they've declared something that hasn't actually been elaborated. And then if we look at the conduct in, for example, intergovernmental organizations, the UN and so forth, yes, we've engaged, we're voting on some nice resolutions, but then we have to look at where's the money. So the the Feminist International Assistance Policy did not incorporate a single new penny of dedicated funds. Well, that's pretty remarkable. You make an extraordinary claim to assist women around the world, and then you don't allocate a single new penny to support it. So I think that's kind of epitomizes the problem here. But if we also look a little further at the kind of, and details matter here, what is the scope of action available to the Government of Canada? Because the Government of Canada may say, and I want to make this point, that we are living in complicated times. and that there has been a global pushback against human rights and democracy, the whole kind of question of post-human rights. And Canada is in a kind of shrinking minority of so-called liberal democracies. Some have said it's one of the rare, still existing liberal democracies. So what's really available to Canada to do? Well, there are a number of things that are available to Canada to do that do not depend on cooperation with others. And the Rohingya situation you and I have discussed before is a case in point. Not just to make a declaration, which took them a long time to make, about genocide, about the status of Aung San Suu Kyi, about whether they would do anything at all at the International Court of Justice, but to actually do it. And the government of Canada does not need to ask anybody whether they would actually file an application at the International Court of Justice, or whether they would support Rohingya authentic voices, NGOs, representative groups, whether they would provide training and assistance for all sorts of groups around the world that are pressured by governments or non-governmental groups. All of that's available for Canada to do in a proactive, human rights-based foreign policy, if it wishes to do so. And unfortunately, I have to say, we're far from that. I mean, it's notorious that, for example, our development assistance remains, for all the discussion that Canada and the Liberal government in particular touts about Pearsonian foreign policy. It was Pearson who came up with the idea of, the 0.7% of GDP dedicated to development assistance. And, we have actually shrunk in our GDP funding compared to even the Harper government. So here, the walk and the, is so far removed from the talk that it really does raise questions about, the credibility, the integrity of the declarations.
But in terms of what Canadians can do, because human rights is obviously not a huge vote getter at, during election time. It's not something that political parties tend to campaign on. And yet Canadians see ourselves as this great champion of human rights, despite evidence to the contrary. We have seen a chipping away of human rights and specifically, for example, Quebec's Bill 21, which I will get to a little bit later. And yet, despite the outcry, despite voices standing up and saying, this is not who we are and we're not being true to our values and, we need more than just words, it seems that we're not getting through. So I know that, sort of public advocacy is not something that in your role that you're doing a lot, but, from your experience, which is, quite extensive, what can you say? Like, is there anything that you could say to Canadians that would say, here's what we need to do?
There are a few things here. I mean, first of all, let me challenge a little bit the idea that human rights is not a vote getter. I agree with you, human rights as such and in foreign policy is not a big vote getter. And a lot of people will say, well, we're struggling to survive ourselves. And, most people are trying to, especially right now, are worried about having a job, having their kids in school, and so forth. But if we think about human rights in its more fundamental conceptual terms, human rights is about decency and fairness and equal treatment and equal opportunity. I think that does motivate a lot of Canadians if we apply that as a broad framework of governance, and actually most parties in Canada, interestingly, they all want to be associated. Nobody is against human rights. And why is that? Because it would be troubling for many Canadian voters and ordinary people. We not only want to believe kind of sentimentally that we're this great human rights country and so forth, but we really would like to see fairness incorporated in good governance and so forth. So I think it partly depends how the topics are articulated and then whether it's consistently applied. I also think that Canada, like many societies, is becoming more and more diverse. And more Canadians are seeing that there are gaps in that fairness, and for which human rights claims in terms of discrimination, exclusion, and so forth, are driving some of these discussions. And then they can link those internationally. Okay, and look, certainly since 9/11, if not before, we have all been living also in under this security. Some people say securitized politics. Fear is a great unfortunately, motivator of people, unfortunately towards often not good behavior. But a lot of governments, responsible governments that have duties of protection and so forth, this has almost necessarily resulted in some constraints on freedoms. I mean, this is a major discussion in the whole human rights field. You know, how much freedom is really possible with also required protection, security, and so forth. And there's no easy answer to that, especially for an open society. Getting that right is very important. And I think that what's happened is a lot of people and a lot of governments have frankly erred. They've gone too far on the securitization. And you know, too many people's basic freedoms and liberties and opportunities have been compromised too much. Issues of privacy and so forth. There's a lot of it is complex with social media and so forth, but basically we haven't got it right yet. Canadians themselves can do a lot. I mean, not only we are a free society, and we shouldn't forget that. Many people died in the past in wars and so forth, that we can remain a free society. But that requires that citizens organize, and you know, our politicians are still attentive to votes, and we do have in our Constitution every 5 years a federal election and so forth. So I think the citizens need to mobilize, and we have the great privilege of being relatively free to do that. And that means we need to become politically active. And what I can say, no, I'm not supposed to be, you know, party political in the sense of my responsibilities as a director of an academic institution and so forth, but I am decidedly in favor of political engagement of everyone. I mean, this is what is required. And yeah, we can talk more about specific situations, but I think through robust debate and a human rights-based approach, actually talking about how some of these standards would be applied, we can get to a better place.
Well, John, thank you very much for joining us on Diversity Dialogues and contributing your expertise and your insight. And to our viewers, we look forward to seeing you again at our next episode. Thank you very much and good day.